sugar baby.
Hello, and welcome back to more DIY sugar baby content with myself, Rosie Quartz, content creator, cosplayer, glitter disaster, and sex worker. Hooray for a platform that actually lets me say sex worker, because I swear if I have to say schmex worker or corn harvester one more time for Daddy TikTok, I'm just gonna eat my way through a whole table. I'm just going to chew through that wood like a combine threshing grain. We're going to power through all those splinters out of sheer frustration. Of course, while my reach here on like YouTube and Spotify is definitely much smaller than it is over on TikTok, and goodness knows if YouTube will actually let me monetize content where I talk about being a sex worker in the future. I have very much reached a place where it has become physically painful for me not to be open about what it is I do and just let people know that, yeah, this is how I survive. This is how I pay my bills. I feed my guinea pigs, make sure that they get like their hay and pellets and copious amounts of snacks and toys. But it is very difficult to kind of do like that sideways little segue thing there of just trying to cover what I do with people, like, especially it comes up in random social situations, right, where even if I online am very blatantly honest about what I do, you still run into plenty of people off screen who have no idea. Maybe they're like family, partner's family, possibly like friends, family, stuff like that. And if you have the kind of background that I do, you're often exposed to people who came from like the same church background, which can be pretty awkward overall. And also being honest about like what you do for a living, as especially if you're like a gay sex worker, then the question becomes like, oh, well, why is your friend associating with you? Like, are they even a good Christian themselves? And that can just lead to a whole bunch of social safety concerns with them for their family, because not masking yourself can also blow the cover on their mask. And that becomes a whole thing that is very tough. So at least in my own journey here, it is a relief to at least somewhere be verbally just direct about saying things like, yeah, sex work, without wondering if the platform is going to ban me completely because of it. Of course, there are other consequences that can come with being a sex worker, and very visible about it, especially if you're talking about things like rights not rescue, because for some reason that can be very triggering to people. Like, if they have a worldview where sex work is inherently a bad thing, well, of course you, the sex worker, are tied into that, and you just end up being on the receiving end of the smackdown of the anxiety that's behind their worldview, because you tend to represent everything wrong with the world in their eyes. Often this idea of, especially if it's correlated to sin, right? Like, if what you do is correlated directly to sin, then you as a person are directly correlated to why this person experiences suffering in the world. It's kind of just a weird feeling to be that person, right? And that kind of just leads me into the topic of today, which is salvation complexes. I was doing dishes and listening into a podcast, a female-led podcast. I think it's called Violating Community Guidelines, talking about the rise of Christian influencers on TikTok. And it occurred to me that I myself now am in a very different position than I was, like, let's say back when I was 17, still leading out in church worship service, things like that. Now, so sorry for what I said when I was an evangelical. Oh man. Oh gosh, the cringiness. However, as per usual, it's kind of a trope now for ex-Christians, is often to say, well, like, I'm not a Christian anymore because the behavior did not match the theology. It was very hypocritical, and why are you behind a pulpit? Why are you on a soapbox on the street side instead of actually going out to help the lowest of the low? And when you hear that little spiel about like, hey, Christian, if you're actually a Christian, why aren't you out helping? Why aren't you out helping people? And I stopped what I was doing and I realized that whole spiel hits differently when society categorizes you among the lowest of the low. Of course, there are varying levels of privilege within the quote-unquote lowest of the low. As an online sex worker, I do not face the same level of stigma or risk to my safety that somebody who, like a sugar baby does, going out to meet people in person, or meeting people through something like people used to do with Craig's Backlist, or even like right from the street. Although, quite frankly, a lot of the times things like sex work, they happen within like a network, of an established network of people that you know, and a lot of sex workers heavily vet the people that they actually do meet in person. However, the attitude towards people who are within sex work is very often that we do not have autonomy, that we do not know what we're doing, and there's kind of a bias, especially from somebody who has a salvation complex. And by salvation complex, I mean somebody who ties their ego to believing that they're helping save others. So it is not uncommon to see somebody with this bias step into our space with this idea that they just have the right world perspective. And if they can convey it to us, then our brains will just switch. And we'll be like, oh my God, you're right. What am I doing with my life? And just to have like this whole come to Jesus moment, turn everything around, and suddenly we're no longer the lowest of the low. And it's just a matter of changing our world perspective, and then we'll do the work ourselves to get ourselves out of such a low place. And it is infantilizing and infuriating. It feels like, and I know that for a lot of ex-Christians, it comes from a good place, but they don't actually realize that when they say things like, hey, Christian, why aren't you out helping the lowest of the low? Listen, please don't. Please don't send these weird people into our space. Like, please do not tell Christians to get out from behind their pulpit and out helping. Please don't. Please do not. What on earth is it going to do for us to have this weird-ass stranger step into our space, tell us that we need to be saved and Jesus loves us, have them walk into our space, maybe give somebody groceries temporarily, maybe just provide a listening ear or help out in a soup kitchen once in a while? What the fuck is that actually going to do for us? Because, excuse me, we have a whole housing crisis here. What the fuck is this random Christian going out to evangelize to the lowest of the low going to do for anybody? Like, your little grocery card there, is that going to solve the housing crisis? Is you stepping into our space to try to change our worldview to Jesus loves you and Jesus loves me so much and therefore I need to stop sinning and then suddenly I live a better life? Is that going to change inflation rates? Please. And is stepping into my space with this theology, is that going to change the abuse encountered within good Christian marriage, unequal power dynamics versus a bad client? Ooh. You see, here's the thing. If somebody decided to look at my life and be like, you know what, I'm going to help you. I'm going to help you and pull you upwards. If they started paying my bills, if they started buying my groceries, they started doing just all of these different things, like paid for home security, were taking care of my pets, maybe paying for my therapy and like medical expenses like eyes and teeth, I would not stop doing sex work. They would just have made sex work safer and more stable for me to engage in. They would have made it so that I felt more secure and possibly drive myself to less burnout doing the labor that I do because I enjoy what I do. And you know what? Yeah, there are plenty of people in the sex work industry who would love to detransition out of it. And that does not invalidate those who would like to stay in it, but really would just love some stability and less bias in legislation and even protection in legislation from bias. Now, the funny thing is about being the lowest of the low, I mean, it hits you everywhere. I'm just out here watching Sandman, thoroughly enjoying it, and then suddenly there's a scene out of nowhere where a demon opens up the gates to hell to let the Sandman through, and as he walks up to the gate, he's like, is it a thief, a murderer, or a whore at the door? I'm like, excuse the fuck out of you. Excuse you? And it hits you in TikToks as well, where you're just scrolling and suddenly you hit some like dumb fuck who's saying things like, sex workers, don't you know there's children on this app? And it's like, obviously we know there's children on this app because your kid is a threat to my safety, not the other way around, Susan. Because of your bias surrounding children and putting us in charge of protecting your child, which we know that knowing sex workers exist is not inherently traumatizing to children. It's not our job to protect kids. And anyone who has that perspective, I'm sorry, but you're not really that smart about social media, because absolutely nothing about social media, not Facebook, not Instagram, not TikTok, not YouTube, not anywhere, is set up to protect children. It is set up to exploit whatever stage of brain development they are at for their interaction and their attention span, and also money through targeted advertising. It is not set up to protect children. And honestly, I am very glad that I can't have kids. I'm not having kids because I would not be able to protect them. In all honesty, this is my own little sidebar here. My take on the internet as a sex worker is there is no way to protect children from the internet. You cannot keep them off of it. It is a part of life now, but there is no way to protect them from it. Parental controls all you want. There's always going to be a workaround. You don't have them all the time. They can just go to a computer at the library. They can get around all kinds of stuff just by going to the Wi-Fi at McDonald's, which is what we used to do at private Christian dorms at the high school. They had all the locks on the internet. They put on every parental lock to the point where they actually banned access to the dictionary. That's how strict it got. All we had to do was walk 10 minutes to the nearest McDonald's and we could access whatever the fuck we wanted to. And a lot of people like to say things like TikTok is a kids app. No, it is not. A kids app would be set up very specifically for children with very specific moderation, trained moderators, content that has been screened prior. That shit would be locked down so hard. If you actually took taking children's safety on the internet seriously, real children's apps would function inherently different from the rest of the internet. It would not be children just making content and going viral across the globe. And a mutual of mine, I believe it was Breezy Sleeves, brought up an excellent point. Everyone likes to say the internet isn't safe for kids. It's not safe for adults either. And that goes back to what I was trying to say earlier about consequences of being visible as a sex worker, because that makes you even more of a target. Plenty of people believe that because a lot of people don't care about sex workers, or they think that because this was chosen, if harm happens to us here, that's chosen harm. There are plenty of people who just actively go out of their way to harm sex workers. It's such a trope within media like CSI Miami and Law and Order and stuff like that. Somebody out there is just like, yeah, we've seen 15 dead prostitutes because this serial killer figured they were an easy target. But in the era of call-out culture and algorithms that can reach millions of people, unfortunately, if you talk about the things that I talk about, that puts you very much at risk of being exploited by other content creators as trauma porn, or being exploited in other ways for shock value. I had another mutual of mine, Juicy Poma, was banned. They had their main account banned on their birthday, and then they were featured on another YouTube platform with over 1 million followers. And Poma likes to talk about rights not rescue. It's all backed up by research. And this guy decides to exploit Poma by essentially twisting rights not rescue into this content creator wants children on the pole, or paraphrase something like that. And that video gets traction over the actual sex worker talking about what they need for their own safety. And of course, this content creator did not protect Poma from any kind of backlash, especially in regards to appearance, misgendering, any of that. It's kind of brutal that way. It is very brutal that thanks to social bias, sex workers can get exploited by bad clients. We get exploited by bad legislation. We get exploited by anti-pornography groups like Exodus Cry, who use this as trauma porn to make money off of us. There's so many forms of exploitation that sex workers have to deal with, but it's often in ways people don't think of. And that exploitation includes salvation complexes from people who step into our space thinking that they can solve everything, bring us up from the lowest of the low by just changing our perspective. And then they get to take the credit for basically being so much smarter and connected to God than we are, and then like gracing us with that, taking the time to grace us with their special perspective that will just like make everything better, give us salvation, and it's tied to their ego. We get exploited by a lot of people who are trying to reinforce their own sense of identity. They're trying to feel like good people. They're trying to feel like they're serving their deity and all this. But at the end of the day, it doesn't help us. And the whole mission trip idea thing, that whole like go out into the streets and serve people, I do not need you stepping into my space to help me get out of sex work. If you really wanted to support me as a sex worker, you'd be hitting up our legislators, taking down FOSTA SESTA, and asking for decriminalization. Also tackling things like the housing crisis, for example, economic disparity. You wouldn't be stepping into my personal space to make my life better so that you could feel better about yourself. And that is a self-serving bias, like emphasis on the self-serving part of that cognitive bias, which is like essentially you give grace to yourself but not to others. A lot of people tend to look at others through the lens of how they would live that person's life. They take that walk a mile in another person's shoes but add the layer of, if I was in your shoes, I would do it this way. When the reality is you have no idea. If you were in my shoes, you have absolutely no fucking clue what you would do. And a lot of people do not know how to decentralize themselves when looking at the lives of others. Like a self-serving bias, if you were sitting in a psychology class, you're going to learn about it with like very generic examples, usually the speeding one, right? With a self-serving bias, if like your friend was caught speeding, you might tell them, well, maybe you shouldn't have been speeding in that zone, or like, you know, the cops sit in that area a lot, like maybe you should have had some environmental awareness, versus you getting pulled over and you're like, sorry officer, I was just tired or something. Like you have valid excuses for yourself for breaking the law, but when you look at others, you're just like, nah. And that self-serving bias is very much applied when looking at the lowest of the low of society, because it's this idea of, well, you're in that position because you're failing. You're in this position because you're traumatized, or you're in this position because you're disconnected from God. But in the same position yourself, trust me, that shit hits very differently. Because when you, as like a sex worker, hear those messages of you are the lowest of the low, and like, oh my gosh, Jesus went out of his way to hang out with the whores and the prostitutes and like the dregs of society, and it's like, well, that would be me. That would be me. And like when people come into my space to tell me that, and like Jesus loves you and go out of his way to do that, that doesn't make me feel affirmed. It makes me feel like I'm on the brunt end of somebody's arrogance. That doesn't make me feel grateful to Jesus. It's like, okay, good for you, Jesus. Good for you for treating humans like they're humans. Thank you for the bare minimum of decent human interaction. Interpersonal support is very important. If you have someone in your life that you know is a sex worker, and you go out of your way to support them and also allow them to support you, that is absolutely awesome. That's incredible. And it's very important to remember that, like, sex workers can support you in return. Be emotional support, be a friend. There's many who like make money and would love to have people in their lives to spend it on, to take their friends out and go do fun things together. Because sex work is not trafficking. Sex workers are not victims. At least not victims of the labor that they've chosen. Because that is what ethical sex work is an active, consensual choice to engage in that labor. There are influences, of course, like socioeconomic, but that is also the case with any form of labor somebody who's a civilian, non-sex worker, has chosen for themselves. Most people are not performing labor unless there is the pressure to eat food and pay bills. But I think as we really start to see deconstruction from faith happening, we're of course seeing deconstruction from social scripts and traditional social values. And that does need to include the way that we view those who have previously been viewed as lower, because it is very important to actually acknowledge that people have agency and autonomy. They're not inherently stupid because they are not where you are in life. They're not inherently just like a bad person or inherently a bad influence to society based on the labor they do. And that very much extends to other at-risk populations. However, I do not want to speak for those populations myself. I'm only going to speak to sex work that does intersect things like, oh my gosh, what else gets associated with us? Homelessness, drug use, things like that. Those are intersections. For those who are impacted by those things, I would say that I would rather they speak for themselves, because once again, they have agency and autonomy, and there are plenty of people that I know who have been impacted by those things, and they are more than capable of speaking about it and putting their input out about being on the receiving end of other people's salvation complex. So many people seem to have this idea that if they stand out on the street corner and scream at us that we're going to go to hell, or they sometimes give us groceries, or they decide to give us 20 minutes of their time to tell us about Jesus, that somehow they have made some grand, profound impact on our lives. And from the other side of it, to be on the receiving end of somebody's theology or in their heads help, we do not necessarily view you as a good person, or like, oh my gosh, thank you so very much. I'm so grateful that you're in my life and that you took the time to tell me about Jesus, blah, blah, blah. Like, we're looking at you like you're an idiot. And that's the irony of it, because these people will show up in a sex worker's life to try to save us in whatever like minimal way that they can, and they expect to reinforce their ego as a result of that effort. But the thing is like they're not going to get viewed in a very positive light. Sex workers are more than capable of knowing and conveying what it is they need. And what they need is not a church service. They don't need prayer. They don't need people volunteering to do very minimal things for them here and there. Sex workers need dismantling of whorephobia. Sex workers need their autonomy to be reinforced and validated, and having someone step into their space to be like, you need to stop sinning because Jesus loves you and this will make your life better. That is not reinforcing a sex worker's autonomy. That is inherently invalidating, and it feels disgusting. I think that's actually something that's really changing about this era, is that a lot of students, post-secondary students, turn to sex work in order to pay for college or university. So aside from participating in sex work, they're also becoming highly educated. And that means that this person who would be considered traditionally in society lowest of the low, a whore, a prostitute, a stripper, these people who've engaged in sex work are getting their master's and their PhD. They're not necessarily in need of any kind of support like that. There's many sex workers out there who, yes, are dependent on other types of support for survival, including things like food banks, living assistance, etc. So many people have turned to sex work because it is the only thing that accommodates a disability. But so many people look at sex work with like one view, that like every sex worker is the same, sex workers are all suffering, sex workers are all in a bad place, that morally and emotionally they're struggling and deprived. And that's not the case. There are many sex workers out there who are still engaging in it even after they don't necessarily need the money from that labor because they enjoy it. And there's plenty of them who are highly educated and making bank and going to therapy, and they don't need theology. There are many sex workers out there existing who are not empty inside. They are not traumatized by what they do. There are so many different types of sex workers, and sex workers have a whole range of experiences. There are some who experience it as absolutely horrible. They never want to do it again, to the point where they'll even state like, look, I don't think anyone should do it, right up to some of the top earners or even like mid and lower income earners who are like, I really like this, I enjoy this, and it's giving me the income that I need to maintain the quality of life that I want. It's not a black and white field of labor, and not one of us can speak for the other. I think it's very important that we acknowledge that it is a wide plethora of experiences, that labor is labor and everyone deserves to perform their labor with safety and stability in the long term as they perform that labor. Because labor does not have to be an empowering experience. There are many, especially those who left evangelical Christianity, who experience sex work as empowering. It has been at times for me. However, that is specifically an empowering experience because I came from a society of people who believe that women are lesser, and that essentially once you're married, consent is completely negated and your partner has complete access to your body and you need to serve them. You don't, and not just serve them anytime they want it, but serve them happily at all times, which is not realistic for a human to do. So to come out of that into sex work where I have complete agency over the content that I make, the collabs that I do, to have agency over my labor, because yes, even in marriage, that is a form of labor. It's empowering. And I experience it as empowering, but that is my experience with it specifically. Well, I want what I say to resonate with other sex workers, to affirm them, to hopefully help them feel seen and like validated by somebody else in their community, I definitely want what I say to be taken to heart by like those who listen in who are like my followers, who are not in sex work, because I think it's very important for many people, because wanting to be good is not bad. When you try to be good using a tool like a self-serving bias, then your innate natural desire to be good may cause harm to the person who's on the other end of your self-serving bias. But when it comes to just like, I want to be a good person and support people, affirming their autonomy and consent is so important. And there's many people who follow me who are also in the process of deconstructing. And this is an important area to look at. How do you view the lowest of the low? If you are ex-Christian, or like Christian who's questioning, or even like Christian who's like, you know what, I don't like the current like social scripts that we're working with, how do we actually listen to people? Then something that is very important is to catch the way that you speak and view those who've been considered the outcasts of society, because the bias for a very long time has been people like sex workers don't have agency. There's an unspoken bias that sex workers are not very smart, or that they've just been so traumatized by a family member or other types of abuse that this is the only thing that their brain could do, and like their brain is driving them to self-harm with sex work. And that bias is not helpful, and it is not accurate. Trauma can play a part in behavior. Trauma can explain motivations for behavior, but not every sex worker is traumatized. And many sex workers do have trauma, and it impacts them in many other ways aside from choosing sex work. Confronting how we view people like sex workers is very important to healing things like generational trauma cycles. It's important for kind of like affirming and growing it's important for affirming and growing society as a whole, but it is also important to confront our own potential salvation complex. And that means asking ourselves, how do I view those that I perceive as being less privileged than myself? How do I look at people who are on a lower income scale? How do I perceive people who are performing forms of labor that are often invalidated as not labor at all? How do I view my help? I think is a very important question to ask. What value do I assign to my help? Because so many people want to improve the world, to save it, and they'll step into somebody else's space. They'll step into somebody else's life when they are not the expert in that experience, and expect to just help by overstepping that person's consent, boundaries, and autonomy, because that person stepping into that new space believes that they have the right idea about how to make it better, because they're not the expert in that experience. Like someone who's not a sex worker, sometimes researchers, educators, medical professionals will have great input, but quite often somebody who is a civilian who has no sex work experience has no clue how to make it better. The people who actually have a clue are the sex workers themselves. Sex workers are more than well aware of the risks of our industry. We already know, and many of us know how to improve it, but do not have our voices prioritized. When legislation surrounding sex work happens, it often happens without the workers. And when people decide to try to help sex workers, and even trafficking victims experience this too, is that, oh, you're a victim and I will, don't worry, I'll take care of everything, instead of asking the person who experienced the thing, what do you need? How can I help you help yourself? And there is a very important distinction between stepping in to save somebody when you have absolutely no clue regarding their experience versus asking, do you need support? First of all, asking, do you need support? Can I support you? We asked this in first aid. Somebody's injured. Hi, I'm certified in first aid. Can I help you? So many people just step into the lowest of the low space with I'm going to help you without even getting, hey, do you need help? And actually taking to heart when we explain what the help is that we need. And when we tell you it's not prayer, you need to listen. When we tell you it's legislation we need help with, we need you to listen. When we tell you it's stability and security surrounding our banking that we need you to listen. We don't need a baptism. We do not. We need to be able to invest and secure and transfer our money safely. We need the law. We need police, and we need the criminal justice systems to listen to us when we say that a client has hurt us. I could go on. I really could go on. There's a whole list there. But thank you for tuning in to my little rant. I woke up very early this morning with just so many thoughts in my head, and this just helps me get them out there into the world. Once again, I'm not the end-all be-all on this subject. I do believe it's very important for sex workers to be heard in some capacity, to share their experiences, to share their thoughts, and hopefully somebody out there got something out of all of this. And I think just to reiterate is that I make so much caregiver Dami content, and the thing that I have learned is most important about being an effective caregiver is to make sure you get consent to provide support, and that you decentralize your ego when it comes to hearing them when they tell you the support that they need, to acknowledge that you don't actually know what support it is they need, they do, and then once you've heard the support that they need, you consent to providing it and providing the support that they specify. So when it comes to supporting sex workers, it's important to ask, do you need my support? What support do you need? And to not decide that different support is necessary. To actually come through with the support that sex workers specify themselves. And also to remember, sex workers have their own voice. They can speak about the issues in their industry themselves. They just need to be prioritized in that way. We need our voices prioritized. But anywho, thank you all so very much for listening and supporting my content. We've got a few new Patreon subscribers as well, so thank you so much for that support over in my content as well. That means I can keep making that content. That's so appreciated. Of course, your worth is not your productivity, and things like affection and care and attention are basic human needs that we don't need to feel guilty about having. We just need to make sure that we negotiate to have those needs met with enthusiastic consent. I hope you have a wonderful week, you wonderful beings, and we'll see you again next time with more do-it-yourself sugar baby content. Goodbye!